You're listening to the Companion Gun Dog Podcast. I'm your host, Grayson Guyer. And with me today is Althea. And for those of you watching on YouTube, you can see we're in a canoe today. There's a couple of reasons for this. One is because I kind of have made a promise to myself that if I'm going to continue to do these podcasts, I'm not going to lock myself in the house, especially with the nice spring weather coming on. I'm going to enjoy being outside. And so you can expect more of this in the future. So I guess essentially what I'm telling you is if you want to watch me paddle a canoe around while I talk about dogs, you can check out the YouTube channel. And I do have some other plans for this video in particular. But I want to get to that in just a little bit. First, I want to talk about some really sad news I heard this morning. I woke up, got everything going, got the kid and wife out of the house, and then looked at my phone, and Emily sent me a text and just said, "Hey, did you see that Mo died?" And so I had not. And then I immediately got on Facebook. First thing that popped up in my feed was the Steady with Style group, and Martha Greenlee had made the announcement that Mo Lindley passed away in his sleep, or I guess at night. I don't know the details. But either way, it's the end of an era. Mo Lindley was a direct protege of Bill West, and was really the standard bearer for the West method of dog training. But he was so much more than that. He was just a wonderful human being. And even though I only met Mo in person one time, I really considered, and still do consider, him a friend, but more importantly, a mentor. And I think a lot of people saw him that way. And so I have a lot to be thankful to Mo for regarding my career as a dog trainer, the way I train bird dogs, the way I view the training of bird dogs, and to some degree the way my worldview. I have spent so many hours poring over the things that man wrote in the last 20, 25 years that he's had an indelible impact on my life in general. And so much of what he wrote and talked about had nothing to do with dog training, and it had everything to do with life and gratitude and the old ways. He always spoke of and wrote about the old ways, and so I guess without just going on and being too terribly gushy, it's just a big loss. It's a big loss personally. It's a huge loss to the dog training community and to the bird dog community in general. Mo just was just a wonderful, wonderful person. And so, Godspeed, Mo. We'll say a prayer for your loved ones, for comfort, and we hope that we get to see you again one day and train with you up there somewhere. I do, I guess it's important to kind of note that I had, and I may have mentioned this in a previous podcast, but I had a wonderful neighbor, and I do remember it now. It's been, I guess, six months, a year ago maybe, that passed away. Similar age to Mo, and I would say probably, healthy guy, but died in a car wreck. And it's taken some time to kind of come to terms with that, but I'm glad I had that experience before hearing this news, because what I realized is, these guys went kind of at the end of their prime, and they didn't experience a ton of suffering. Mo, for all intents and purposes, died with a check cord in his hand. And I don't think there's much more any of us could ask for than to not spend our waning years in some place we don't want to be, not having fun and doing the things we love to do. So we can all be grateful for that. And so again, you know, thanks for all you did for us, Mo. Um, Today, the topic that I had planned to discuss before that news was uh, arousal versus drive, and it just happened to coincide um, with the time in this class that I had a couple of dogs that I knew were going to be kind of waterfowl dogs. It's tough if the dogs have not been introduced to water in the spring class, because it's mid to late March now, and the water temps and the air temps are just getting to the point where uh, where it's comfortable for the dogs to be in the water. You're not going to hype a dog out. You're not going to make them hypothermic, putting them in 50, 55-degree water. Um, this time of year, as long as you're careful, I guess you could, but that's not the concern as much as if we're going to introduce something new, some new environmental thing, that we want it to be comfortable. We want it to be fun, and it's just hard to make cold water with a cool air temp fun for for us or for the dog or any of that. So it's just something to be aware of. And so I'm kind of struggling with that right now in the class. But one thing I do, since we're spending some time down by the water, obviously just letting the dogs make their own decision. We'll throw some live birds in the water, some balls, just get them playing. We'll come out and swim with Althea and just let them witness that and get excited and maybe have a little friendly competition. I'm sure you can hear the dogs in the background. I got the chain gang out up there, and we did some bird work this morning, and I just decided to kind of stop and tape this while I had a little bit of time, and we're going to have good weather today. And so again, with the water temps being cold, wanting to kind of work towards it, decided to do some kind of boat intro stuff. So the last couple of days I've been working on that with Odin and Ghost and Izzy in the class. And it really fits extremely nicely with this topic of arousal versus drive. And I got kind of hung up on the topic, something I'd been thinking about for quite a while, because of a conversation I was having with my friend Bobby, who's a detection dog trainer, really a police dog trainer of repute out of Sanford, North Carolina. Bobby Lane, he owns PB Canine, that's person-born detection canine. And he's just a heck of a trainer. He's a great mind, and he's a good friend. And so if you have any needs in that world, that's the guy to go to in terms of all your detection dog needs. But that being said, we had a conversation. I was explaining to him that I had my new Springer, and I was so pumped about her, and was on the subject of whether he thought they, were the right kind of dog if you had a good one for detection work. And of course, he said absolutely. He goes, the one thing, that can be a little bit of a hindrance sometimes is they tend to be so high arousal. And I knew exactly what he meant. But I got off the line and I just got to thinking, like, it's interesting that this is a term we as dog trainers kind of throw around a lot. But I think it can be very confusing for the layman. But at the same time, I think it's a word that I've heard misused potentially, or at least in a context that isn't very clear. And so I always think that it's important to kind of add clarity in places. So I just have thought on it a long time. I've asked some friends about it. And I guess I'll give you my quick thoughts is when I think of a high arousal dog or a dog that's in a state of arousal, it's the energy. When we talk about hyperactivity, that's what we're talking about. I have this energetic dog that's kind of a pain in the butt. That's a high arousal dog, right? But a lot of times, I hear especially pet dog trainers talk about it and kind of use it interchangeably with drive, and to me, they are not the same thing. And so one reason I'm in this boat right now, recording this particular podcast with Althea in the boat, is she's a perfect example of a low arousal dog. And so I'm going to have some opportunities to show you higher arousal dogs doing some canoe work. But but it really helps if you're a hunting dog guy, especially if you're a duck dog guy. If you just like hanging out with your dog, if you like to paddle. Paddling is one of my favorite pastimes. So I tend to spend a lot of time, um, all except for the coldest times of year, in a canoe. And I really like canoes. That's my preference. I've always I don't know. There's something about a good canoe that just it's hard to replicate the experience with any other type of paddle craft. So, and this is my favorite boat that we happen to be in right now. This is an older '90s era Penobscot, Old Town Penobscot 16. This was one of the later Royal X boats, which is a ABS plastic that they quit making, but was extremely popular for canoes. So it's a nice lightweight boat in this. It's a durable boat. It's easy to portage, and the lines on the Penobscot just really are my favorite. So it tracks well. You go straight in a straight line. It's a fast boat. It's 16 feet long, and it's not a wide boat. It's pretty narrow compared to other canoes you might plan to fish or hunt out of. And so for that reason, it kind of has a reputation of being a bit tippy. And so it's got what I would say is what we would consider low primary stability. And that primary stability is the ability to kind of make a canoe rock, right? And so if it's lower on the primary stability spectrum, then you can rock it over. But it's pretty high on what you might consider the secondary stability. So I can lean into it and I just can feel it. So secondary stability is being able to take it over on its side to some degree without capsizing the boat. We always want to avoid that. But it takes a lot of getting used to be in a boat that maybe has really good secondary stability, but lower on the primary stability spectrum. And boats like that, you can, they're just maneuverable. If this is a super long paddle, by the way, this is not a great paddle for me to be showing off that I'm into canoes. But I don't really mind. It's just a long paddle, and when I'm paddling from the stern, I don't particularly care. If I'm up front, I like a shorter paddle, or if I'm really solo and want some maneuverability, a shaft for me would not be as long as this one. But that's aside the point. The real point here is, if you put a dog that's uncomfortable, just like a human that doesn't quite understand primary and secondary stability, into a boat like this, they're going to feel unsure of themselves. But that said, it's the boat I want to be in most of the time. This is just the paddling my other boats do not bring me near as much joy as paddling this boat. Just a very comfortable boat to be on. And I'll demonstrate a different boat, but I have a much shorter boat. It's a 12-foot boat with a square stern, 12-foot canoe with a square stern, but an extremely flat bottom, an extremely wide boat, and it paddles terrible, right? But it does really well. You put a trolling motor on it, you can kind of get around, and it's a great vessel to fish and hunt from. So I spent a ton of time in that one fishing, and I'll show it off a little later and give you kind of the full specs, fishing and duck hunting from that boat. So, but it really, you get the best performance out of that thing using it with a trolling motor. It does pole nicely in shallow water, so I use it for that a lot. And if I like to fly fish and sight fish, and so it's a good little boat for that. I can throw it in the back of my pickup truck. I don't have to load it on a rack. So it's a real convenient boat to work from, but it's also a great boat to introduce inexperienced dogs to being in a boat, because you have that super high primary stability. That boat just won't rock the way this one does. And so the dogs tend to feel a little more secure in there earlier. But kind of back to that topic of low versus high arousal, it gets really helpful in a boat, because obviously, whatever the dog happens to do is going to affect me if I'm experiencing low primary stability, or even if I have high primary stability. One of the issues with a wide flat bottom boat is you have this super high primary stability but low secondary stability. So when I lean into it, it takes a lot of time to get that thing to lean over, but when it does, it's really unstable. By the time you get it over here, it's ready to go over. And so just something to be aware of if you start feeling like you're leaning in a wide flat bottom boat. It's not a good position to be in. Whereas in this one, I can really do what you call heeling this thing over, get all the way on one side of it, and now my paddle is closer to the water. It's actually a really good way to kind of just end some fatigue and move pretty quickly in a canoe, right? Um, so you can't do that in those boats. And so just from a paddling experience, it's terrible. But for the dog, it's much more stable. And when we have these either dogs that we have not conditioned to kind of exist in a state of lower arousal, especially on a boat, um, then uh, then having that high primary stability is going to be very helpful. If we have dogs that we want to go fishing or hunting with or paddling with on our small boats, um, and they are maybe not as naturally low arousal as a dog like Althea, um, then uh, then we got to make sure the boat can take it. And we got to make sure we're prepared to go into the water. And so like I would not put a high arousal dog in here. It's a dog that's playful. Anything novel is going to maybe trigger that kind of erratic behavior, that playful hyperactivity. And so there's certainly a nature component to it and a nurture component to it. Some dogs, my spaniel namely, is just a high arousal dog. She's a playful, happy dog. She's energetic. She's always kind of trying to push the action. And if something is new to her, she's going to be curious and inquisitive and bouncy and playful about it. And whereas Althea, like for the most part, her whole life has just been spent kind of either asleep or doing something awesome when she's in drive. And Althea is she's not the highest of the high drive dogs in the world, but she is a pretty high drive dog. So when I bring her into focus, when I give her a task and she wants to do it, it's going to satisfy a drive. She does it with intensity and focus and heart. She's a great athlete. But when you put her in this boat, and especially if she's a little bit uncomfortable and doesn't like the sensation of rocking, which when she was a puppy, she didn't, none do, her reaction is going to be, I'm going to cling to the bottom and relax and chill out and just hope that things settle down and I don't go over. Whereas if I were to put Billie Jean in here, which I have not done yet, then I would expect her, if she feels a little panic, instead of cloistering up and kind of sticking to the bottom really hard, maybe to bounce around or try to jump out and escape the situation, right? So, the way they can kind of react to a state of panic, these high arousal dogs will probably, you would expect them to be much more active in that reaction than a low arousal dog. So things to keep in mind with that high and low arousal and things I want to talk about with it. I'm going to define the terms as we always do clearly. And then I've asked some friends to kind of give me some blurbs on their thoughts on arousal versus drive. And so I'll read some of those off to you. And so because I'm filming with my phone, which is probably the dumbest thing you could possibly do because I don't want to lose my phone, but because I also don't have any fancy gear, I've had to actually write my notes on paper like a caveman. But let's define the terms first. So drive is an innate or biologically determined urge to attain a goal or satisfy a need. And so we've talked about that. We've defined the term drive. I most often like to talk about drive in regards to the drive reduction theory of psychology we've discussed before. And basically that's kind of drive reduction is performing an action to get back to a state of stasis. So, you're in higher states of drive if we're talking about food drive, if you've been deprived of food. And so you want to go eat, you want to go find something and eat in order to find that balance again. The hunger is the imbalance, right? And so we breed dogs oftentimes, especially dogs we breed with high prey drive, we talk about a lot, like in our retrievers and our bird dogs. We've kind of built them in a way that they're kind of naturally unbalanced to a degree. It's like they're never going to be satisfied. That their desire to chase prey is insatiable, right? And so that's a good thing for us. And so we can usually, with those kind of dogs, if we play our cards right, we can use that drive to manipulate their behavior, and we often do. And so that's why oftentimes, a lot of in the current climate or the current state of dog training, most people, when they're talking about positive reinforcement, at least in the pet world, are only considering working with food. And the ones that are working with toys, they everything's really clean. But our bird dogs and our retrievers and our gun dogs, it's like really hard to train and not be training in a balanced paradigm to some degree using positive reinforcement, because every time you give them the opportunity to satisfy their prey drive, you're positively reinforcing a behavior. And so that term being defined again, right? It's a biologically determined urge to attain a goal or satisfy a need. And so for us, the primary one, obviously food, if we're going to use food in training, but mostly prey, as we want you to go pick up that duck and we can throw a ball and you're going to go retrieve it, or you're going to go at least chase it, capture it, possess it, whatever, right? So that's how we use drive. And then arousal is defined, and I'm trying to keep the sun in my face, but we might fail at that at some point because we got a little bit of wind out here. And of course, one thing about this boat is it does tend to act as a bit of a sail if you don't have a load in it. And right now, usually I would have Althea up a little more. I wanted her in the frame for this, but she's a great little ballast. And just, I guess, maybe quickly before I define the term arousal, Althea, go on, get up there, go to the front. Just demonstrate that a little bit. So when I put her to the way front, this boat really rides so much better because the ballast is up there. And I guess I'll break down and discuss a little more about the Canoe. This boat is a symmetrical boat, so the front and the back are the exact same. If you were to cut this boat in half, it's a carbon copy. Each side is of the other. So for soloing in a boat like this, it's really nice. Instead of sitting in the stern seat, which is on the opposite side from me, which is the one that would be seated more to the rear, when I'm in here alone, I'll sit in the bow seat, which is positioned more towards the center of the boat, but not far enough center that if I don't have a ballast up front, some weight up front to kind of keep the boat trimmed out right, then it doesn't handle quite as nicely. So having Althea up in front is perfect. So when I'm out in my boat paddling around, she's actually the perfect kind of weight at that end of the boat to kind of keep this boat trimmed out nicely. And so that's why I moved her to the front when we were dealing with a little bit of wind. Hopefully she's still in the frame. If she's not, you get the idea. You've seen it at this point, right? And so instead of having her in the middle, positioning her to the front can really helps to have her lay down because it's less tippy that way. But at the end of the day, she's chill enough that even when she's sitting upright, she's not really it's keeping the center of gravity of the boat low. But getting back to arousal is basically, it was defined as the state of alert, awake, or stimulated, right? And that's it. It's very cut and dry. It's just an alert dog. It's a dog that's awake, alert, stimulated. When you say stimulated, it's like, what's the action? Where's everything? And so that is not a state that necessarily needs to be triggered. That's kind of the state of being of the dog most of the time. And so when we think of like hyperactive dogs, oftentimes, you'll go and you'll see a lab in the context of training. It's bouncing all over the place. It's acting a fool. It's kind of a pain in the butt. And, and somebody, well, that's a high drive dog, and that's what you get. You don't have to have one with the other, right? And so I would say that for me personally, I find high arousal to be an undesirable quality, especially in my retrievers. In the spaniels, it's more forgivable. I want those dogs to push the action a little more, to be more active than reactive. And I would say for the bird dogs, it's the same way. So we expect a little higher state of arousal in our questing dogs because they're the ones that have to initiate the game. They have to go looking. And if you think about the way they were, have been bred over, multiple generations, multiple centuries of breeding these types of dogs, whether we're considering them a breed or an early land race, That makes perfect sense, right? So my spaniels and my bird dogs, they're going to be a little bouncier, a little jumpier by nature. But we can develop a context in which they understand that that's inappropriate, and so that's always helpful. And the boat work I do um, tends uh, to bolster that, right? So it's like I need you to learn to sit in one place for long periods of time and just chill out. There's nothing good's going to happen if you go crazy. And so, the last 3 weeks of having this class I've got of dogs in, we're spending a ton of time when we're not out bumping birds and hearing gunshots and doing some control work or whatever in a high state of drive. We're usually in the house or out in the yard or somewhere on a place board or in position, whether it be sitting or if the dog chooses to lay down, I don't particularly care. But I want you in this one place in space time and to chill out there and recognize that we're not going anywhere. So just relax. And that's what I call deflating, which I've spoken about in the past. So uh, if I have these naturally super high arousal dogs, that's really hard for them, but we can influence it. And even with these naturally high arousal dogs, I can set consequences for when you leave this space, there's a consequence for it, and you don't want to do that. And so you might as well go right to this place. And while you're there, you might as well just chill out and not anticipate a release or not anticipate breaking out on your own because that's where you are. So just settle in and enjoy the ride. And that's what we want to work towards. So we can absolutely have an influence on the dog's arousal. Um, it's certainly much easier with dogs that are naturally inclined to be that way. Uh, but obviously we give all dogs the best shot we can. And so it's important to recognize that. So if you have maybe, especially like a versatile breed that you want to duck hunt with, and you kind of, you know, uh, as you're thinking about what you want to do, dream of being in a small boat like this, paddling around with your Draghar or your short hair or your poodle pointer or your Munsterlander or whatever it happens to be, and you're going to use them for duck, and you're going to get access your property. Small boats are a perfect way to do that if you're looking for good public land, because oftentimes big riparian buffers tend to be places we're allowed to hunt and fish because they're places that they don't want to have a lot of development. And so you tend to have a lot of public land in those areas. So having a little paddlecraft is a great way to access those things. You get the stealth of not running a big motor, and the convenience of being able to drop it off a bank anywhere without having to go to the boat ramp and fight all the yahoos out there, right? So it's a great tool for that. But that being said, just recognize if that's what you're looking forward to doing, you better prep for it, because you don't want to find out in January when it's 20 degrees and there's sheet ice out there that your dog's not capable of being in a boat and without not tipping it over and getting everything wet and making life generally miserable for us all. And so with all that, I'll get to the friends I asked for not their definition, but their thoughts on drive versus arousal. And the first one I asked, and guys, bear with me. This is my handwriting, which looks like somebody from the Revolutionary period, but it's not actually that. It may look pretty, but it's not always legible. But I asked Emily Shirey of Short Hairs and Shotguns, and my normal partner in crime on this podcast, what her thoughts on drive versus arousal were. And she says, I see a lot of people confuse drive and arousal in short hairs in particular, right? That's where she made her reputation in that particular breed, and she ends up working with a lot of them. And so let's get back to it. Short hairs in particular, it's a problem when they allow over arousal, thinking it's drive, but arousal is not productive. So it gets back to what we were talking about. Arousal is that state of play and hyperactivity, often confused for drive. The big difference is drive is a productive state of being, meaning it's easy to train in. It's easy to manipulate behavior with. It's good that's what we need when we want our dog to go get a duck, right? But arousal is the thing that's having the dog bounce around the inside of the blind, knocking over your buddy's guns. And that's completely unproductive and not beneficial, and the thing that gets us not invited back to the next time. She goes on to say that the dog's continue to rehearse unproductive or unwanted behaviors in a poor emotional state. And I think, I think what she means by poor emotional state is just, again, it's an unproductive state of being, an unfocused state of being. So the dog can be very happy, potentially in a high state of arousal, but it's not one that benefits us in any way. And so when they're rehearsing behaviors, unproductive behaviors, they're more likely to do them in the future, right? And so high arousal dog is out there digging holes. It's got to have somewhere to put energy. And the more it does that, the more inclined it's going to be to do that next time. So I like that. I think that makes a lot of sense. And then I went on to ask Ben Lipinski about drive versus arousal. And he said drive motivates the dog. You can never have too much drive. And that's essentially his state. So and Ben, for those of you that don't know him, I've done a couple of podcasts with him in the past. He's a high level player in the protection sports, does a lot with police dog work and stuff like that. And he appreciates drive. He doesn't care. You can't give him a dog with too much drive. And I understand what he means. And I honestly feel the same way. If you give me low arousal like this, then there's no cap to the drive for me personally that I'd have. And I think that's when people like that dog's too high drive. You hear that a lot. I don't think that's possible. I think the dog, when it comes to productivity, the dog can never have too much desire to accomplish the job, as long as we can temper that with training, right? If it becomes unproductive, the dog needs to be manageable. But I don't think you can ever have so much drive that it negates the dog's malleability or biddability or tractability or whatever you might want to call it when we talk about being able to manipulate their behavior. Honestly, the higher drive, usually the more easily the behavior is manipulated. Ben goes on to talk about arousal, and this one is where I really started writing sloppy, and so hopefully I can get in there with it. But he goes, arousal is more like energy level. A dog can be super aroused without being more motivated. High arousal mistaken for drive is a detriment to the working dog. It leads to all the problem behaviors we try to fix. It's possible to have a dog who is highly aroused but unsuitable for the job. Yeah, I mean, I think I don't know that maybe it leads to all the problem behaviors, but I think you could tie it probably there. If our problem behaviors were being too lazy, but I can't see where that would be the case in anything. So yeah, I think that's right. So high arousal dogs tend to be the ones that we struggled to train. They're the ones that's just like, hey man, just sit down and pay attention, please. They're the ones that can't sit still when you try to teach a downstay. They just continuously pop up. And then finally, when you try to put enough reps in, you get it right, but you just hit it just enough pressure where they kind of fold up. So they're either like not performing the behavior you want because they're too fidgety or they're too highly aroused. And then finally, when you use a level of compulsion that suppresses the arousal, it tends to maybe have an emotional impact on the dog that's not helpful either, right? And so I'm particularly thinking of dogs that just go, oh, I've been fine, and then they sulk and they lay down instead of sit or something like that. But you've worked really hard to kind of try to mitigate the arousal, with consequences, whether it be reward-based training or compulsive training. And it's just it's very hard to overcome. And so I think that's what Ben's getting to with that. And I agree 100%. And then the last person I asked was Francis Metcalf. I love, of course, I've done a podcast with Francis in the past, and I just consider him, just like Ben and Emily, people I look to, when I ask their opinion of something, it means a lot to me, right? Like it's just, it carries a lot of weight with me. So these are some of my favorite trainers that I'm asking for these blurbs from. So Francis, and I love the way Francis thinks. I love he's a wordsmith, but he just has a different brain than a lot of other people I know. And so his perspective tends to usually be unique in some way, but also very provocative in terms of my thought process. And so it helped. It's just a different angle on things, and this is no different. So he goes, they're percentages. He goes, light beer is arousal, whiskey is drive, and I love that, right? But it wasn't quite jiving with what I was thinking. So light beer is arousal, whiskey is drive. Kind of makes you think like, okay, that they're kind of the same thing, but one's, um, you know, I'm not quite sure how to put it, but not quite as powerful as the other. And that was not where my head was. And so when I read that, I was like, I don't know if I agree with that. And then he goes on to say, the dog sees the world through a heat map of arousal levels. And that immediately stopped me in my tracks from kind of the disagreeing. Goes, the white and yellow zones have little pull. The orange red zones have more. If you have built drive for a basic survival need, and pardon, this is when my writing gets terrible. So if you have built drive for a basic survival need, which is what all drives are, right? So and we do build drive in our young dogs, and we've talked a lot about that in the past. That will show up as a big red dot with a very little fade off at the edges, right? And so imagine you're looking through a thermal imaging scope, right? And that's what it is. With drive, the dog will risk it all, but they can be aroused by something novel like a snowy day. Sure, a dog in drive is aroused, but an aroused dog is not necessarily in drive. And that made a lot more sense. And so I love, I really, really love the way he says that at the end, and it makes the light beer whiskey analogy make sense to me. Boy, the wind picking up a little. Right? So it's like arousal is just less productive. It just doesn't have the effect that whiskey does, right? As much as guys like me may love light beer and sitting around enjoying them on a canoe during the day. But he's right. And so you can have, it's hard to have drive without arousal. It's, I guess, near impossible to have drive without arousal. And so that does, I think that's what Francis is getting to. But arousal without drive is just doesn't have any punch to it, right? And so, again, just a different thought perspective, and a great way of thinking about it, and a great way of envisioning it, a great visual with the heat map. Francis, he said something, he left a comment. We were kind of having a comment exchange on a Instagram reel I posted maybe the day before yesterday. And he's not into pointing dogs, he's just getting into hunting dogs, but a long time trainer in the protection sports and pet dogs, and very well thought of. But I love it that he's curious enough to kind of stick his toe into other things. But I had a pointing dog on point that was just starting to point. It was really the dog's very first point. This is Moose, the short hair, and he's on a loose bird. And he lets me get all the way around to the front. And as I come in, I approach from the front, which is one thing we often do when we're working our pointing dogs. And he starts to flag, and I kind of explained in the reel that would fade with experience. And he asked me, what's flagging? And we kind of go through the exchange, and I explain, and I always say, there's kind of a natural anxiety, I think, that goes with the pointing behavior. And after more exchanging, he goes, so basically pointing is like flirting. And I love that metaphor or analogy. It's that pointing is flirting to some degree, because there is the anxiety of not wanting to lose the bird, but also wanting the bird worse than anything in the world. And so you have this balance of negative punishment and positive reinforcement that's teeter-tottering on point. And it's just a really great way of thinking about it. And so it's very much like flirting, which is you have to be aggressive, but not too aggressive. And it's a playful thing we do. And I think that's a very neat and unique way of describing it that I will use forever from now on. But that's it. So those are those guys' thoughts on drive versus arousal. I don't think there's a whole lot more to say on this subject, other than just to maybe wrap it up. Just recognize, like, high arousal, that's what we usually mean when we're thinking of that annoying, energetic dog. High drive is not annoying. High drive is productive. And a dog is certainly aroused in drive. But dogs that are not in drive and are aroused are just a pain in the butt to be around, right? And so we can affect it for sure. You know, if you go back and listen to some of the other podcasts where we talk about the crate and the place board or just long periods of stationary work, being in position, um, or I've often used it to describe suppression. What I'm trying to suppress is arousal. That's the idea, not the dog, but that emotional state or that state of being. Um, and so, if you're going to be in a boat with a dog, a little boat like this one, a tippy boat like this one, understanding arousal and understanding how it differs from drive is very, very important. And so thanks for listening. I'm going to add some videos to this thing. So if you are going to go over to YouTube, this part right here will be the audio I'll pull, and that'll be the podcast. But I think when I upload this to YouTube, we're going to make it more of a tutorial about how to be in a boat with a dog, how to train your dog to be comfortable in a boat. And so if you have any interest in that, go over there. I'm going to put up some footage of some of these client dogs I'm working. Obviously, you can see Althea just hang out and ride around with me and do well. And who knows? We haven't done it yet, so there might be some comedy worth checking out in that video. So go over there and give it a look. And I guess before I wrap this up today, guys, too, I want to mention a couple of things. I promised my friend Brooke Bartels that she would be the title sponsor for my next episode. Unfortunately, it just took me very long to get that out. And Brooke has a new endeavor that is cookies for conservation. And so it was probably pretty important for me to give her this plug before she went to Pheasant Fest and had her booth there. But I think she did make an Instagram page with it, and it may be something she continues into the future. So for those that don't know Brooke, I think she may be 13 by now, but she was 12 last year when she VC'd her dog Rush, who was a daughter of my Pete. And she's just a wonderful dog trainer and obviously has a heart for the game we pursue and conserving those animals and the habitat that they need to survive. And so I think that's a very worthy objective, and I would encourage you all to go find Cookies for Conservation on Instagram and buy some cookies. Like, get some cookies. I have not done that yet. I need to do that. I like cookies a little too much, to be honest with you. And so, but I mean, it's for conservation. So, whatever. And then, and one more plug for myself. I have uploaded my first course to the Teachable platform. You can find it through my website at the Learning Center. But this one is Woodcock 101. I developed and designed this one to go with my woodcock training hunts in January, but we do a lot of Map Scout tutorial with Onyx, and then basically go through. I really like the platform, but it's a kind of a living entity, right? So I've uploaded it. It's available. Obviously, this is my opinion of what it means to pursue woodcock and scout for woodcock and hunt woodcock and work your dogs for woodcock. But this is the thing that I want all of the clients that I'm going to take out on those training hunts to see and be aware of before I take them out. And basically, I'm trying to help them come up with a replicable process to be successful in the pursuit of woodcock. So go check that out. I priced it at the same price as what an hour lesson would be with me. So it's $75. I tried to keep that valuable, and I do plan to kind of, if you're in that course, once you buy it once, you got it forever. And then I would like to kind of set it up so that I'm interacting with the students in there somehow. So maybe we'll do like some Zoom rooms or something like that, and just an ongoing indefinite basis. I want it to be something that once you buy it and you look at it, it's not done. That as I learn more, or as I find better ways to get the content in there, that it just gets perpetually better. And that you have, access to me for whatever that's worth. So go check those things out. And again, thanks, guys. Thanks for giving me a reason to come sit on my canoe and talk about dogs for a while. And so we're going to go pull some of the client dogs and get to work.